Now. All right, so here we have a panel that, so Amy and I put together this panel with the title Textuality of the Text. Again, based on our collaborative approach to working with ensayos libertarios en la humanidad en el futuro, so that we could offer that bilingual edition that was still missing. And so for this portion of our symposium today, I will start with, I'm just going to read a few, the introductory paragraphs of an essay that I have coming out this November on Small Express. And I know that I think Jorel also has a forthcoming presentation of essay publication about Capetillo with them. So this is, the title is Reading Luisa Capetillo, which is based on some presentations I did in the spring for CLACS, LACUSL, also for Women and Gender Studies, and also for the Recovery Conference at the University of Houston. So here we go. Reading Luisa Capetillo. As a preamble, let us establish that Luisa Capetillo holds a significant place in the trajectory of Puerto Rican and Caribbean feminisms, and that approaching her works is learning to read from outside the canon. Her being the daughter of 19th century immigrants who instilled in her the love of reading, as well as her experiences of living through the historical juncture of 1898, are biographical and social-cultural factors that inform her views on social transformation. In the words of Stephanie Rivera Berruz, Capetillo's feminism, and anarcho-feminism at that, was, quote, brewed at the core of her understandings of workers' emancipation as a woman who herself labored in the trenches of modernity, end of quote. So a century after Capetillo's passing, a new question has emerged in my ongoing appreciation of Capetillo's legacy, again, coming in from the lens of reading Latin American women writers of the time and the other feminist writers in Puerto Rico, and also in the sense of, you know, the background of the Latin American essay that we know it's, as Mary Louise Pratt would call, the tradition is very androcentric. So what does it mean to read Luisa Capetillo? What does it mean to read this trailblazer and colonial subject? Capetillo's indomitable bravery, as remarked by Norma Valle Ferrer, is as relevant as ever. As the understanding of feminism is becoming and needs to become even more intersectional, Black, Indigenous, people of color feminist expressions find themselves, as Sherry Moraga denotes, quote, negotiating multiple worlds to further social transformation via initiatives toward the demarginalization of those colonial subjects and those stripped of agency by the colonial matrix. Nonconformist is one way, one of many ways, to describe the personal idiosyncrasy of Puerto Rican feminist writer-activist Luisa Capetillo. Her reader-writer role is indeed salient in the context of what Angel Rama calls the Latin American lettered city. Rama underscores the predominant role of the written word as the binding one, which brings to mind Capetillo's sense of obligation to express her thoughts in writing, yet not without an orality that transgressed that very tenet of the lettered city. On his part, Jorel Melendez Vadillo draws from Rama's work and develops the concept of the lettered barriada as a makeshift intellectual community comprised of an enlightened working class. This amplifies the context in which we read Capetillo as a subversive nonconformist who infuses the written word with orality, thus making us listen to her as we read her works. So for this panel now, so Amy and I will approach some questions again, dealing and grappling with these texts that were very, very raw, all right? So Amy, I don't know if you have any remarks before we go into the questions.
No, I think the first question, all of these questions that we're going to kind of be asking one another today and talking about are all things that came up in our many, many Zoom Teams meetings over the past 2 years, in which we read closely together and grappled with sense and meaning and context and contextualizing Capetillo's texts. So I think if we want to jump into that first one, that
Sure.
first question, we can talk a little bit about just practically speaking, what our process was for approaching these two texts, to give you some context as to what we were doing and what we didn't know we were doing as well.
Right.
So that said, sort of the first question we wanted to think about is, what has been your experience reading, approaching, transcribing, translating Capetillo's work? So Nancy, I'll present that question to you.
All right. Well, I mean, the experience of reading Capetillo, that first impression is that you're reading something that is complex and that demands your attention. That also requires those tools of strategies, again, if you're coming in from literature, from reading outside the canon. And then, in the process of specifically transcribing Ensayos Libertarios en la Humanidad en el Futuro, that first step before sending the transcriptions to Amy. So I was, sometimes I would try to make it make sense, in the sense that if there was on the page something that would look like it was not quite legible, to sort of fill it in sometimes, or try to respect it as much. But I wasn't as intent on, okay, we need to actually have a transcription that is deeply raw. And then I have a very, very hard to read facsimile of a copy that I had for La Humanidad en el Futuro. And then I realized that I was relying too heavily on the transcription of the Obra Completa by Norma Valle Ferrer. So, in this process, going from the transcription, going to the translation then requires, there could be instances in which the syntax is really hard, because again, there's a sense of urgency that Capetillo needs to get this out. And the syntax sometimes is really complex, or sometimes, you have to make sense of what's the subject here, right? And for the translation, there were some decisions that we had to make so that the translation would be accessible. But then from that process, going back to the transcription, thinking, okay, so there is an obra completa of her works in Spanish, right? And for instance, the transcription there is clearer in the sense of it's a grammar that it's easier to follow, yet to convey that urgency without losing meaning, you can still get the message of it. Then we made that decision of, we're leaving accent marks where they don't belong, or sometimes, there are some typos that are there to convey, again, instances in which it does not impede meaning, right? So we wanted to respect the text as much and present it in that regard, without much intervention, either from a translator, transcriber, editor approach.
When I think for me, in that first approach to the text, I had how we kind of started this project. We've been talking about it for like 10 years, and so finally had the right time to do it. And so Nancy sent me these texts, and I read through them, and the first thing that really struck me is that, I had read her already translated works in Spanish and in English, but I hadn't read these two initial texts. And I was struck because they were not a kind of text that I'd ever approached as a translator. So texts that I've approached as a translator in the past have been governed, right? They've been, the writing is sort of disciplined into the standards of practice and standards of genre that we learn about in our academic settings, right? So it was really outside of sort of the standards or approaches that we think are proper and appropriate. So that was exciting. And although I felt like, wow, this is something, I've never translated anything like this, it did speak to me as something, oh, that's Buddy, my cat's gonna say hello now. It did speak to me in its orality. So I thought to myself, well, this is like something I've interpreted before, because I've been an interpreter for a long time, a community interpreter as well as a translator. So it was so much more to me an interpretable text, one that I would approach through mechanisms of interpretation as opposed to translation. So that was initially striking to me. The other thing that I thought was really interesting at the beginning of all of this was seeing those two, the transcriptions of the two essays that we worked with, Ensayos Libertarios and La Humanidad en el Futuro, and seeing the sort of multiple possible source texts. So when we're working in translation, the original text is called the source text, and then the translated text into, in this case from Spanish into English, is the target text. And so for me, it was interesting to think about, okay, well, here we have I have a couple of source texts to work with. Which one do I choose? Which one do I follow more closely? Or do I look at both of them and understand how meaning is made in the transcription, from Capetillo's very raw sort of facsimile copy to Valle Ferrer's transcription of it, to Nancy's transcription of it, to understand through comparing those texts, how do others make meaning of in these transcripts, and then how will we, as I move those texts into English. So that was, I mean, I think kind of the most striking first impressions of the two texts.
Yeah, and I mean, pretty much with what we have talked about, you know, we have some questions here about the biggest challenges, right, of what the text requires that is different for us. And then Amy and I, you know, in our conversations, we talked about one of the things that, you know, perhaps a challenge, but when you start working on it, you realize is that these texts and the way that we're approaching this process also of translation is that it requires collaboration. And the collaboration of, you know, say someone who has been studying Capetillo since, you know, the early aughts in my case, and again, from a literary perspective, and then the eyes of a translator, and then seeing all these other, you know, interdisciplinary approaches, as we saw, you know, with Stephanie's presentation today, and we will see later on with Jarell's, is that it really, I mean, and it's also that sort of like that unruliness, right, that we saw in the first keynote, that it's pretty much, it informs Capetillo's life and her writing, that unruliness, that this is not a text here for the elite, right? This is something to be talked about, to be again something that is done in collaboration, and the process itself required that collaboration, because I was able to go back into those first essays that I had read before. I had taught them in class, in seminars, you know, over the years, but it gave me a new lens to go deeply into those close readings, coming again from, you know, the conversations about what to do with the translation here, right? How to respect the text and not really interfere with the syntax, and have that engagement, that deeper engagement with the text, that it was actually completely new for me. As I was telling Amy, over the last couple of years, this was the first time that I had the chance to work so closely. It's kind of like this very hands-on, you know, that grainy textuality of those texts, and discuss them and think of, if I were to translate this, how to present this, you know, with a sense of urgency, what to do here with a lens and an approach and an experience that up to that point I had never had. I had never had the chance to just discuss in depth those texts with someone pretty much until this process. So that this is also one of the reasons we wanted to share this also with a wider audience, to also see the process and the importance of collaboration, and that some texts require that, and it's actually a way of starting to do justice to them.
Absolutely. I think that as a translator working on these texts, you know, sometimes you think about translators as being really solitary and they're kind of working on their own, and you know, it's really their interpretation of what's going on, and then they may not be able to talk to the writer or even talk to people who know a ton about the writer. But in this case, and I think this is appropriate for Capetillo's text as counter-archival, right, and as non-canonical, and as really disruptive to genre and to literary genre. That kind of text that falls out of sort of the norm is, and particularly in her case, is a text with many voices. It's a text that is speaking to different communities, is engaging communities, right? We move away from the sole author and the individual voice into this kind of hyper heteroglossia in her text, which I think is really interesting. And to translate that kind of work, I couldn't think of any other way to do it except in collaboration with Nancy, because what would happen in the practical translation work that's involved in moving these texts into English, I would come up against certain expressions or whole paragraphs that I couldn't break open. I couldn't quite, for as much as I tried, and here's my own sort of very Western training, right? I couldn't hold on to meaning enough to put it into English. So for me, that was very challenging. And so one of the things that I appreciated about working in community with Nancy on this is to say, okay, well, what do you make of this text as a Capetillo expert who knows what she's thinking about, what her history is, right? What is her context of writing? So with writers who, like Capetillo, who it's not always immediately apparent what the kernel of truth is that they're trying to express or convey. Without that, I think that collective, collaborative translation work is a way of approaching disseminating non-canonical texts and counter-archival texts. When we have a sort of community engaged research and work with those texts, I think we not only reflect the multiple voices in the text themselves and multiple perspectives from the margins, but we also have so much more input into the product in another language. So for me, working in collaboration with Nancy on this project was absolutely necessary. I don't think I would have been able to do it any other way. And the other thing that it taught me, and that Nancy taught me working on this project, is to be okay with translating ambiguity, which for me, as a translator and interpreter, is really, it was a challenge, because I wanted it to make sense. I wanted us to make the meaning from this text. And there are certain points that to this day, I'll read them and I'll say, I'm not even really sure. Like, this is so ambiguous to me, but that's okay, right? It still means in its ambiguity. So that was a big takeaway for me in a text like this.
Yeah, I mean, that ambiguity, and that there were some passages, and and we will give you a few samples pretty soon of, sometimes we had to just accept that ambiguity, because it's also part of, again, that unruliness, and that we don't have to impose meaning or interpretation, right? It's open for this sort of like reading and interpreting in community. So in the process of working, right, on this collaboration, and usually thinking of essays, we read them, right? But how impactful was it to visualize Capetillo as a reader, as a lectora at the tobacco factories, as well as an author?
I think that for me, understanding the orality in her text was key to translating it. So just procedurally, in terms of translation approach, this was the first translation that I did more as a site translation than as a straight text to text. So what I mean by that is, because her voice because she relies so much on orality, right? There's a lot of sort of apostrophic talk. There's a lot of anaphora, lots of repetition, lots of almost slogans. There's this element of being at a labor protest, being at a rally, sort of the discourse of labor protest that Wolfson talks about is very clear in her text. So for me, just practically translating it, it wasn't really sufficient to translate writing, if that makes any sense. It was better for me to read the text out loud in English. So I'm sight translating. So I'm looking at the Spanish text and I'm reading it out loud, or I read it and then I say it out loud as if I'm interpreting it, which is a way of getting at the meaning and the sense of what's spoken without trying to be too close to the order of words she uses and the way she uses the written language. If that makes sense for the non-translators out there. Hopefully for the translators, that makes sense. So for me, it was a lot of reading out loud. I had to read out loud her original text, and then I would speak out loud or interpret out loud what I understood of her text, and then I would type it out. So it was kind of an indirect oral process in which I had to create an oral target text in order to transcribe that oral target text onto the paper. And so for me, that was very different. I've never translated that way before. So that was important. The other thing that I think was important for me was to think about the discourse of labor protest as resistive. So in Stephanie's talk, one of the things I was really curious about, hopefully she'll come back in here and address this question, is kind of how she uses the discourse of labor to connect some of her different philosophies, right? It's almost like it's almost like a touch point in the middle that she can go from one to another to another to another. So I wanted to ask Stephanie about that, but that was something that I found really interesting. She would go from citing spiritist literature to talking about the AFL, or to talking about labor organizers or politicians or whatever. So she would come back to the discourse of labor protest, which, as we know, is really, it can be both written and oral. It can be in a manifesto, and it can be in a protest. It can be a chant. So for me, listening to that labor speak was important. And I've been lucky to have had the experience of interpreting at labor protests and at union meetings and things like that. So that was really helpful for me to listen to her and her orality. So yeah, what about you on that, Nancy?
Well, I mean, it's from our conversations about if this would be her, then saying this out loud, like she wrote it to be read out loud as a, then when you envision her, right, as the lectora, like, and that's why we titled this Assuming the Podium, right? As she takes on the podium to read to the factory workers, then the urgency, all of it, the textuality of it makes a lot of sense. That it's really, I mean, it's written, right? That written form, that it's binding in the letter city is not written with that purpose necessarily to become like a canonical essay, but it's done so that it could be read out loud so that people can listen, right? Because, you know, contextually, the working class, you know, if you were at a tobacco factory, it's very likely, I mean, you wouldn't have any formal education, you wouldn't know how to read or write, but you're listening to all of these ideas. So you're being educated in a way that, again, requires that immediacy, that orality. So also from what Amy was saying is that in a way you're translating a text then through the approach of interpretation. And I remember, Amy, you mentioning that in the case of, you know, interpreting, you have the speaker right there. So if you need to ask for clarification from the source itself, you could. So that's when it reverts you back like, oh, but this is still a translation, right? So you're also in between those two. But it's listening to her that allows then for that meaning, to convey that meaning, and also why it was useful to read it out loud, to listen to her. And actually, we have some passages here that we wanted to share with you, just a few samples, right? That, you know, passages that really struck us so that we can show you the original in Spanish, and then we can show you the translation. So this is from Ensayos Libertarios. This is from chapter 3. And you're going to see the core tenets, right, of Capetillo and her influences come together, but also notice, the style, the orality, the syntax. And it says, la humanidad es buena y oportuna cuando nace de un modo espontáneo. Cuando la imponen los déspotas, no. Porque no es humilde aquel que sufre de humillaciones porque otro se las impone. Si es humilde el que lo hace por su gran virtud, siendo libre de evitarlas. La cantidad no es únicamente, como dije anteriormente, el óvulo con que socorremos de un modo miserable a nuestro prójimo. Hay diversos modos de ejercer el amor con nuestro prójimo, en vez de criticar, instruir, y cuando encontramos un hermano falto de estilo y lleno de defectos, no debemos despreciar o burlar ni criticar su torpeza. Predicad urbanidad, no burlar la ignorancia, enseñad lo que sabéis, poneos en su lugar y pensad que si no os hubieran enseñado, tampoco sabríais.
And this is one I had to say out loud to and read out loud a bunch of times because it's a sermon. I mean, it is, you can feel that sort of energy, that oral discourse, discursivity in it. So the translation into English is, it is good and appropriate to be humble when it comes about naturally, not when tyrants impose it. People who suffer indignity at the hands of others are not humble. True humility is born of great virtue and freedom from imposed humiliation. As I said earlier, how much we donate isn't the only way our aid to our brothers and sisters is ungenerous. Instead of criticizing them, instruct them. And when we meet an unsophisticated brother who has endless flaws, we shouldn't look down on him or make fun or criticize his ineptitude. Teach social graces, don't mock ignorance. Teach what you know. Put yourself in their shoes, and remember that if nobody had taught you, you wouldn't understand either.
And something also that really struck me from this passage is that you can also hear the tone, the style that we also see in that letter essay to her daughter, right? Instead of doing this, like by default criticizing or doing something out of routine or because that's what people do, then actually do something constructive, right? Instead of criticizing, instruct them. Because remember, you were not born with all this knowledge necessarily. So that sense of, it's not just about only denouncing, but also that call to action that we already see this from Ensayos Libertarios. And then this is from La Humanidad en el Futuro. And this one, this one was very hasty. So this one, it's much shorter, but this one we spent many hours, sometimes in just a couple of paragraphs. So here's a sample from chapter 2. Porque es la verdad, que si la dueña de la casa toma al hijo de la cocinera y lo envía a bañar y luego lo envía a la escuela y está en contacto con sus juegos y se interesa igual que haría con sus hijos, le tendrá tanto cariño luego y se tomará el mismo interés que para sus hijos. Sería gran ventaja para la generación que crece, la que toma a la madre por cocinera, que se ocupe ella de sus hijos. No pensemos que si cocina le pagan. Eso no, porque debemos pensar que sin servirnos, viene cualquiera a pedir algún traje o un plato de almuerzo. No pensamos eso, no vemos nada más que la necesidad. Igual o con más derecho debemos hacerlo con la que nos sirva, pues lo que le pagamos no la pone al cubierto de la miseria, pues cuando llegue a una edad de avanzada, ¿qué le esperará? ¿Mendigar o el hospital? So here we get the general gist and the meaning, but when we get into the translation, it's tricky. So here's the translation.
This is a passage we went over and then we came back to, and then we went over and we came back to it, because this is such a great example of what that close reading does and why an interpreting voice might be a little bit, this passage is more suited to interpreting than to translating. And then at some point we just had to say, okay, this is how we're going to render it. This is what it's going to be. So notice just the kind of cutting up of the sentences, making it shorter, trying to elucidate a little bit, but not interfering too much. And so the ambiguity is still there. Because the truth is, if the owner of the house took the cook's child sent him for a bath, and then sent him to school and watched him play and took as much interest in him as with her own children, she would soon love him and pay as much attention to him as she pays to her own children. This would be a great advantage for the next generation that's coming up. That generation would think the cook is the children's mom and that she's able to take care of them. Nobody should assume that just because someone is cooking, they're getting paid for it. Not at all. Even if we're not servants, we ought to think that we could serve anybody who comes around asking for clothes or a plate of food or a lunch. We don't see it that way. We only think about folks' needs. Similarly, or more rightly so, this is what we should do with all who serve us, because what she's getting paid isn't enough for her to get out of poverty. And when she gets old, what's waiting for her? Begging or the hospital. And this last line, begging or the hospital, is one of those repetitions that come up in her text, in particularly in this Ensayos Libertarios. This comes up so much. It's like the orality of, so right, when we think about oral literature, we think about oral literatures as literary systems. There is that repetition to bring listeners back to the point, right? Whereas with the text, we can go back and we can reread. Here we have to keep repeating ourselves in order to bring the point home repeatedly. And that's what she does with that begging or the hospital. It comes up so much in this text. I mean, even when I read this now, there's still some of that ambiguity in certain sections of it. However, what I think is fascinating about this is how much she's packing into this short text. It's super rich. The code of ethics and morality in here really shines through in a hyper succinct way. And that potentially complicates understanding when you're doing a super close reading.
Mm-hmm. And here we have.
So this is a part of Ensayos Libertarios. This is an original facsimile version of it. And Nancy and I talked a bit earlier about writing in community, transcribing in community, and translating in community as a way of approaching her work, Capetillo's work. And one of the things that I did is I started translating based on transcription. And then after I had translated this entire essay, I went back to this version of it, which, as you see, is it's got a lot of texture. It's got a lot of graininess to it. And one of the things that I just appreciated when I was going back through this version of this particular source text and my translation are the annotations. And so if you see if you look, you see like a numbered 1, 2, 3, you see little sections marked off, you see checkpoints. And so it almost felt like here I am reading this with another reader who's already read it, who's trying to put some sort of order into it so that they can open it for themselves. They can open it in a way that they can understand it. So this kind of strategy actually helps in some ways with the translation process and also with the transcription process, because based on some of the notes and comments that this reader, whoever this reader was that marked it up here, or multiple readers, we don't know, sometimes they would make changes and make some corrections that really did open up meaning for us. So we would either incorporate those into the transcription if it really impacted meaning, or it helped me understand how to translate something. And then Nancy and I would talk about it and we say, oh, okay, yeah, that's okay. This makes more sense. Let's go with this. So we wanted to show you how this community reading of these old texts extends to a community that you don't even realize is there until you get into the older source text.
Yeah, because here we're getting also like this particular reader and what they're highlighting, like they're trying to create sort of like an outline of some points, right? And here we have other instances.
So just quickly, one of the points I wanted to make about this, about translating this text, and it really sort of aligns with something that Stephanie and Jorel were just talking about right at the end of the last section, is how through translation ideas circulate, and how is translation part of the crosswinds that make that landfall of ideas, right? So in her text, one of the things that Capetillo would do is she would cite. So here she's citing Samuel Gompers, who is the longstanding president of the American Federation of Labor in the US. And he talked extensively about Puerto Rico and ended up working with Santiago Iglesias Fantin, who was a Spanish-born Puerto Rican statesman, I believe, politician, but also anarchist, correct?
Well, I mean, he was a
pro-labor character. And so here she is citing Gompers. However, on the left-hand side, that's the citation, all of the that she uses in her texts, and all of the yellow is what she takes from a translated version of a discourse by Gompers. On the right-hand side, you see the original Spanish translation of what Gompers wrote. So we don't know who translated this, but what's interesting about how she cites is her editing of it. So you notice that there's a whole bunch more in the right-hand side that you don't see in the left-hand side. And that's how she handles citations. She adjusts them, she paraphrases, she edits. So that was something for me that was very interesting. Nancy, if you want to look at the next slide real quick, I just wanted to mention that when in the translation process, so for a translator, if you have a citation that's translated into the source language of the text you're working in, I always go to look for the original citation. So for this Gompers essay, Capetillo tells us this is an essay that, or this is a discourse he gave at such and such a meeting in Washington. Okay, fine. So then I go look for that. I couldn't find it, but I could find a translation, which is this middle document, Justicia para Puerto Rico, and then it's by Samuel Gompers, the president of the American Federation of Labor, and there's no translator cited. So then I think, okay, well, then I got to be able to find this original English, and so I thought I tracked it down. So in this piece on it's like a brochure, like a journal of America. It's called the American Federationist, a labor journal. And there is down under editorial, a plea for justice for Puerto Rico, P-O-R-T-O, Rico, right? So I said, okay, well, here's the original. And then I read it and it's completely different. So here we have this sort of prevention from tracking down ideas and how they circulate. So one of the things that I got really interested in is all of the different citations that she makes, how do we track them down? And what I wanted to do is provide a comments on the different citations section or an appendix in the translation at the end of it. So when we start thinking about how do these ideas circulate, we can see, okay, well, this person translated this, here's the original, how did it change, etc. So for me, this was one of the most interesting pieces of working on this piece.
Yeah, and actually the fact that then when we think about how these ideas, right, how they travel, how they make landfall, how we often think of how does a text travel, and we tend to think of something printed or a book that, went from one place to another and one person gave to someone else. It's also how a text travels that may not be that physical text. It could be, here's the printed essay, and then here's the translation or the interpretation or what someone heard, the notes that they took, how they presented, how somebody then made sort of like a sort of digest and brought it into what they, so how the ideas and those texts travel that are not always in a physical way, and they're not necessarily traceable in a way that we in academia would find the easiest necessarily. And I know that we're at 11:50. I just wanted then to remark a couple other things, which is that as we worked on this collaboration on this bilingual edition, that textuality, right, of the text, that graininess, the different readers that come in, because you have people making notes right on the margins there, or not so much on the margins. how the ideas travels, how these texts are, you know, translated, interpreted, and moved around, and again, distilled in a way that may not be exactly like the original. So in that unruliness of Capetillo, we also see that she had her very own way of integrating those influences. And, you know, we do that close reading and deep reading, and we find the registers and just sometimes it sounds like from a very biblical approach. It's like all the references and influences that she's bringing in and condensing in these rather short essays, Ensayos Libertarios en la Humanidad en el Futuro. It does attest to that brilliance and the way that she not just combined, but also presented these ideas in an integrated fashion as that sort of like moral imperative. So last thing here is that we do have the good news that our project, we have signed a publishing agreement with Editora Educación Emergente in Cabo Rojo, Puerto Rico. And I see Jorel clapping. He has also published with them. So for this bilingual edition, they gave us a lot of really useful feedback, especially, you know, with all parts of it, really, and really good feedback also with the translation. I mean, these are scholars who know Capetillo. And so there's going to be like this open libro libre version. And we also got funding to do una tirada, a print of 100 physical copies. So we're very excited about that. So let's see what else. And the title for that is Luisa Capetillo, Escalando la Tribuna, which is a phrase that Julio Ramos uses, especially in the most recent edition of Amor y Anarquía. So Escalando la Tribuna, and thinking of these two first essays as Capetillo escalando, like assuming the podium, because with the other works that have been translated and that are better known, we see a lot of the same ideas, even in a more philosophical or distilled fashion, like a more sort of like how she hones in all of those ideas and the way that so we see also the trajectory of how she was presenting her counter archive. So since I know we went a little bit over time and this is break time, the next portion starts at 12:05, and Julie, you can stop recording this portion.